If you believe Europe's borders were drawn by noble kings in marble halls, you've been lied to. They were forged in a mountain slaughterhouse where 12,000 men faced a choice, an impossible suicide charge or the total extinction of their faith. Look closely at the dust of 1212. You're seeing the precise moment the Western world almost ceased to exist. Imagine the sound, thousands of tons of heavy iron and muscle slamming into a barrier that shouldn't be there. The horses aren't breaking through, they are screaming, their legs caught in a trap of cold steel and human bone. Beneath the hooves, 10,000 elite African warriors are literally chained together, knee to knee, creating a living, breathing, bleeding fortress of iron. They are the Black Guard, and they don't move, they just kill. And 50 yards behind this carnage, the Almohad Caliph, Muhammad al-Nasir, sits in eerie silence on his shield. He isn't leading, he's reading his holy book, ignoring the arrows thudding into the dirt around him. This is the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, the most desperate gamble in the history of the Spanish Reconquista. Before we unearth the brutal truth of how these men survived, if you value history stripped of its romantic lies, hit subscribe. Does religious fanaticism make an army stronger or just easier to trap? Let me know your thoughts. To understand this bloodbath, we have to kill the myth of chivalry. This wasn't a Game of Thrones, it was a war of total erasure. By 1211, the Christian North wasn't just losing, it was being hunted. A terrifying new superpower had surged from the Sahara, the Almohads. They weren't the tolerant scholars of ancient Córdoba. They were fundamentalist cleansers who saw the squabbling northern kings as a plague to be scorched from the earth. Their advance was a tidal wave. They didn't just seize castles, they erased the people inside. When the fortress of Salvatierra fell, the monks weren't captured, they were butchered, their remains left as a message for the next city. The road to Toledo was wide open. King Alfonso VIII of Castile watched this green horizon with pure dread. He was a man haunted by a ghost from 20 years ago, the Battle of Alarcos, where he had lost everything and fled in shame while his men were executed. Now the nightmare was back, but bigger. Intelligence reports suggested the Caliph was bringing the entire weight of North Africa. The numbers were so vast, they allegedly drank rivers dry. The Caliph even boasted he would turn St. Peter's Basilica into a stable for his horses. This was an existential threat to everything. When Rome heard the news, Pope Innocent III realized traditional diplomacy was dead. He declared a crusade. Suddenly, the local skirmish in Spain became the center of the world. He offered a get-out-of-hell-free card, a plenary indulgence, to anyone who marched. The result was a chaotic flood of French knights, German mercenaries, and Italian zealots, the Ultramontanos. They were hungry for blood and plunder, but they were walking into a cultural powder keg. These foreign fanatics expected a black-and-white holy war. They weren't prepared for a Spain where Christians and Muslims had traded and lived together for centuries. By 1212, Toledo was a ticking bomb. The French knights were disgusted to see Muslims living peacefully under the king's protection. To them, this was heresy. Why travel 1,000 miles to kill heathens if you let them live in your own capital? Riots turned the city into a morgue. Alfonso was trapped between a biblical enemy in the south and his own violent, uncontrollable allies in the north. He had to move. He had to lead this fractured mob into the mountains to face the beast. But he wasn't just fighting the Almohads, he was fighting the earth itself. The Sierra Morena mountains were a wall of jagged rock, and the Caliph already held every door. 12,000 knights were marching into a bottleneck. They knew it was a trap, but waiting meant a slow death by siege. So they marched toward the heat, the narrow passes, and the chains.
The campaign began not with glory, but with a war crime. At Malagon, the garrison surrendered. The French Crusaders ignored the rules of war and butchered every single man. Alfonso was horrified, not just by the cruelty, but by the strategy. If nobody can surrender, nobody ever stops fighting. When the king tried to discipline his allies, the alliance shattered. The French were already miserable, boiling in their mail under the Spanish sun. They felt cheated out of loot. So days before the battle, the unthinkable happened. The bulk of the foreign army simply quit. They turned around and went home. In a heartbeat, Alfonso's strength was halved. The crusade was dead. Now it was just a local resistance force against an empire. But this betrayal actually fixed something. It left the men with skin in the game. Leading them were three rivals who usually wanted each other dead. First, Alfonso of Castile, the architect, fueled by a 20-year-old debt of shame. Second, Peter II of Aragon, the reckless celebrity king looking for a Mediterranean legacy. And finally, the wild card, Sancho the Strong of Navarre. Forensic science shows Sancho was nearly 7 feet tall, a literal giant in an age of small men. He hated Alfonso.
Castile had stolen his land. He had even flirted with an Almohad alliance just to spite his neighbor. But the Pope forced his hand. Or perhaps the giant realized if Castile fell, he was next. These three stood together as the army reached the Sierra Morena. The plan was the Despeñaperros Pass, the only way south. But the Caliph was ready. He had fortified the cliffs. Alfonso realized they were walking into a meat grinder. The path was so narrow they'd have to go single file while archers rained death from above. For 2 days they baked in the sun, trapped with no water. Retreat meant the end of Christian Spain. It is here that history turns into a legend. A scruffy local shepherd named Martín Alhaja appeared from the brush. He claimed to know a cow path, a forgotten trail through the peaks that bypassed the blockade. It looked like a death trap. Was he an Almohad spy? Alfonso looked at the giant Sancho and the reckless Peter. They had no water and no time. They trusted the peasant. Under the cover of total silence, 12,000 men and horses threaded the needle of the peaks. It wasn't a road, it was a scar. Knights dragged their horses up cliffs where one slip meant 1,000-foot drop. If the Almohads heard a single clank of steel, the army would be slaughtered in a line. But on Friday, July 13th, the vanguard crested the final ridge and spilled onto the Mesa del Rey. They had bypassed the trap. But the victory felt short-lived when they looked down. The valley wasn't occupied, it was buried in people. A white ocean of tents stretched to the horizon, arranged with terrifying geometric precision. In the center sat the red pavilion of the Caliph. When the Caliph looked up, he didn't see a threat, he saw a mistake. To him, the Christians have just cornered themselves on a plateau with no supplies and their backs to a cliff. He outnumbered them at least 2 to 1. He told his advisors that Allah had delivered the lambs to the slaughter. He didn't even attack, he just waited for thirst to kill them. For 2 days, the army stared. Inside the Christian camp, men were chewing on their leather belts to trick their stomachs. Alfonso knew the end had come. On Sunday night, the order was given, "Confess your sins, tomorrow we die." Mass was held in the dark, no crying, just the sound of sharpening steel. Sancho checked his mace, Peter donned his gold armor. Alfonso, the man who had trembled for 20 years, finally found peace. He had nowhere left to run. Monday, July 16th, 1212. The silence was broken by 12,000 men tightening their saddles. Alfonso organized a trident. Peter on the left, Sancho the giant on the right, and the king in the center with the Knight Templars, the special forces of the age. Across the valley, the Almohad formation was a series of concentric death loops. The front line was disposable, thousands of volunteer jihadists whose only job was to die while exhausting the knights.
Behind them, the Berber infantry. At the very back, on the hill, the Caliph behind his ring of chained guards. At mid-morning, the ground shook. The Christian vanguard hit the Almohad line like a freight train. The front line evaporated. It looked like a win, but it was a tactical illusion. As the knights pushed deeper, their momentum died. A charge only works if you're moving. The Almohad line was too deep. The Christians hit the wall of Berber spears, and suddenly the tanks were stuck. The Almohad light cavalry swarmed the flanks like hornets. The knights were boiling in 50 pounds of steel. Dehydration set in. The vanguard was being swallowed. Alfonso watched his best men die and turned to the archbishop. He said, "Archbishop, here we die." This was the moment Western history almost ended. But the archbishop grabbed the king's reins and screamed, "No, sire, here we shall live and conquer." Something snapped in the old king. He didn't order a retreat. He did the one thing a king is never supposed to do. He drew his sword and charged alone into the center of the massacre. If your leader charges into certain death, do you follow him or save yourself? Be honest. Seeing the royal banner fly forward instead of backward was electric. The exhausted knights found a second wind of pure adrenaline. Peter of Aragon unleashed his Catalan knights on the left. On the right, Sancho the Strong saw the Almohad center thinning as they tried to encircle the king. He signaled his heavy cavalry. Now 3 kings were fighting side by side in the same mud. The sheer weight of the counterattack was a physical force. The Almohad infantry buckled. The Christians punched a hole straight through the center until the dust cleared and they saw the prize, the red tent. The Caliph watched his empire dissolve. He saw the 3 banners converging on his position. His arrogance was gone. He looked at his final line, the 10,000 chained guards. The knights galloped up the slope, but physics intervened. You can't charge a horse into a wall of men who are literally chained together. The charge ground to a bloody halt at the feet of the Caliph. The horses were tangling in the iron links. The guards stabbed upward into the horses' bellies. It seemed the miracle would fail 10 feet from the finish line. They needed a miracle, or a giant. Sancho of Navarre realized hacking at the man was useless. He aimed for the anchors. Legend says the 7-foot king spotted the iron stakes holding the chains to the earth. With a roar, he spurred his horse directly at the barrier. Some say he jumped the chain. Others say his mace shattered the links. Either way, the chain snapped. The moment the tension broke, the human wall collapsed. The cavalry poured through the gap. Inside the tent, the Caliph didn't stand his ground for a martyr's death. He panicked. He scrambled out the back, jumped on a mare, and fled, leaving his Quran and his honor in the dirt. When the army saw the red tent fall, the rout was total. The battle was over, but the massacre was just beginning. The 3 kings met at the summit, covered in the gore of the Black Guard. They had done the impossible. But the Crusade mindset took over. No prisoners. For 20 miles, they hunted the fleeing survivors. The body count was so high, the area became known as the Valley of the Dead. Sancho the Strong took the chains as a trophy. If you look at the flag of Spain today, you are looking at those chains, a permanent memory of the moment the tide turned. As the sun set, the soldiers found themselves in a literal gold mine. The Caliph had brought the treasury of North Africa. The looting was a frenzy. They found enough gold and silk to fund kingdoms, but Alfonso took the most important prize, the Caliph's personal battle standard, a massive tapestry of silk and scripture. You can still see it today in Burgos. But the gold couldn't hide the smell. By morning, the valley was a biohazard. Tens of thousands of bodies were rotting in the July heat. The Christians couldn't find wood to cook with, so they used the thousands of broken spears and arrows to fuel their fires.
Before they fled the stench, the survivors sang a hymn of thanks while standing on a carpet of corpses. This was the psychological pivot of history. The invincible empire was dead. Standing there, they realized that if they united, they could take the whole peninsula. The Caliph reached Marrakesh a broken man and died a year later, likely poisoned by his own court. But the aftermath wasn't a clean victory. It was messy and riddled with disease. Immediately after the win, the army marched on Ubeda. They promised mercy, then sacked the city anyway. But then an enemy appeared they couldn't kill: dysentery. The plague swept the camp. The coalition that had shattered an empire dissolved because the victors were too sick to walk.
The irony is that almost none of the three kings lived to see the fruits of their labor. Alfonso died 2 years later, his health ruined by the campaign. Peter of Aragon died 1 year later, not fighting Muslims, but fighting other Crusaders in France, a tragic twist of papal politics. And Sancho the Giant became a reclusive hermit, growing so obese he couldn't ride a horse, dying alone in a tower. The stage was empty by 1215, but the map was transformed. The door to the south was kicked open, and it would never close. Unity is not a choice, it is a survival mechanism. How did 12,000 knights beat an imperial army? It wasn't just God, it was a collision of philosophies. The Almohads were built for the desert, speed and light cloth. The Christians were tanks. By accepting battle in a narrow valley, the Caliph negated his own speed. He turned a chess match into a car crash, and in a crash, mass wins. And the shepherd? He wasn't an angel. He was a local who was tired of the Almohads eating his sheep. It's a reminder that local intelligence beats global strategy every time. The Black Guard's chains were the final mistake, a symbol of fanaticism that became a physical cage. The victory saved Europe, but it sowed the seeds of the Inquisition. It taught the kings that religious purity was a weapon. The road to 1492 began here. If the chains had held, Christopher Columbus would never have sailed under a Spanish flag.
The world you know wouldn't exist. History isn't dry facts. It's the story of a giant with a mace and a king who conquered his fear. If you want to see the dark side of what happened next to the Knights Templar, click this video right here. And remember, Victory Chronicles is where we find the truth in the dirt. If history is written by the victors, what part of this story do you think the Almohads would tell differently?